Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Nguyen Huy Thiep's short story, The General Retires. Thiep is one of the most important voices in contemporary Vietnamese literature. He's sort of most famous for being part of what's called the Renovation movement. And to be fair, I'm getting this information from the introduction to the Norton Anthology of World Drama. I actually don't know that much about Vietnamese literature, but according to the editors of the Norton Anthology of World Drama, Thiep was, he is, I believe he's still alive, but in the 1980s, Thiep was a leading voice in a movement that sought to liberalize Vietnamese literature. Because from the 1940s, during the Vietnamese struggle for liberation from French colonialism, particularly the struggle led by the communists, the dominant mode of art in areas controlled by the communist government was socialist realism. Basically, socialist realism is a sort of glorification of the working class and the sort of noble striving toward a proletarian future and things like this. It's a very stylized, very idealized form of art. A lot of the old, like, if you're picturing the old sort of like Soviet posters or People's Republic of China posters, North Korea posters of stalwart peasants and workers striding forward into the future or whatever they are, that's what we're thinking about with socialist realism. In the 80s, the communist government of Vietnam liberalized in many ways. They removed a lot of the censorship elements that had existed prior, and they liberalized the economy, allowing for a certain degree of private enterprise, even though the country was still communist. In that space of artistic liberalization was what we call the Renovation movement. Basically, this was a move toward more sort of realistic, self-aware, cynical, in some cases, literature and art. Pieces that presented complexity, that presented people as complex and contradictory, and that even in many cases identified problems with the way that Vietnam was being run. And Thiep was one of the key voices in that. And The General Retires is one of his most famous short stories. It's a complex short story about a general who retires. It's told from the perspective of the general's son, with whom the general comes to live. And there's a lot of tension in the story because the general has some very old-fashioned ideas about how things should be done, whereas the narrator, or in some ways more accurately, the narrator's wife, has much more contemporary ideas about the way things should be done. And when I say the general has old-fashioned ideas, I mean more sort of properly communist, egalitarian, anti-capitalist, anti-profit-driven ways of looking at the world. And the wife is more sort of embracing capitalism and embracing this idea of like, yeah, we've got some servants, they're the lower classes, we're the upper classes, that's how things should be. So it's this much more, not just liberalized, but this even pro-capitalist way of looking at the world, while still in principle existing within a socialist system. So one of the things that I think is really, really fascinating about The General Retires is the tensions that run through it, just consistent difficulties about conflicting worldviews, about the narrator's responsibility to his father, etc., etc. And we get that right from the beginning. The short story is broken up into pieces. And in part one, I actually want to just, I think, no, I'm going to read you sections of part one, but I'm going to read you big chunks of it. So most of part one you're actually going to get to hear. So the opening paragraph begins, "In writing the following lines, I've reawakened in some of my acquaintances feelings that time had diluted, and I've also violated the sanctity of my own father's grave. I had to force myself to do this, and I beg the reader, out of respect for the strong emotion that compelled me, to judge lightly my weak pen. This emotion, I will state from the beginning, is the need for me to protect my father's name." So that's a really interesting opening. And actually, I'm going to read you some other bits from this opening before I tell you why I find that so interesting. So the second bit I want to read you is actually just sort of a note. The narrator says, "My grandfather was a Confucian scholar who later in life taught school." Now, bear that detail in mind. A little bit later it says of his father, while he was away with the army, "Although occasionally he would return, each visit was short. Even his letters were short. Within those few lines, I recognized a great deal of love and concern." Then the narrator describes the house that his father had built for the family. "My house on the outskirts of Hanoi was built 8 years before my father retired. It's a beautiful villa, but rather uncomfortable. I had it built according to the plan of a famous architect, a friend of my father's, a colonel only adept at building barracks." And then the last bit I want to read you. "In our household, however, we always thought of my father with feelings of glory and pride. Even in our extended family, in our village, his name was held in tremendous esteem." So I think this opening section introduces two really important components that I think are in interesting tension with one another. The first, remember the detail I told you to keep in mind, that the grandfather was a Confucian scholar. Now, those of you who have watched my video on Confucianism in the Chinese philosophy series will know that one of the things that's really, really important in Confucianism is reverence for one's ancestors and paying proper respect to those in different social relationships with you. So in that opening paragraph, when the son says, "In writing this, I am going to shame my father, but I do so to protect my father's name," that's an interesting element, because in Confucianism, you owe a great deal of respect and deference to your father. To shame your father is a profoundly immoral thing in Confucianism. And yet, to protect one's father's name is actually a really important element here. It's something that Confucians would identify as a very noble thing to do. And so the narrator is in this troubling position from a Confucian perspective, because on the one hand, he's presenting elements of his father's life and experience that the father would probably prefer were not ever made public. And yet he does it to explain his father. He does it to sort of explain and to memorialize, in a way, the man. And of course, ancestor worship, reverence for ancestors is extremely important in Confucianism. The other thing that we have that's introduced in this first section is the idea of conflicting forces existing within the same moment. This idea, for instance, that the father doesn't return from the army very often, but when he, but but he sends these short letters. And even though that's all the communication, the narrator says, however, I recognized a great deal of love and concern. So this notion that the father cares about them, even though he doesn't express it in the way that many of us, particularly in the Western tradition, contemporary Western tradition, would expect or hope a father might express his love for his family, it is nonetheless clear to the people in the family. We get the same kind of tension with the description of the house, that it is a beautiful villa, but rather uncomfortable, built by a famous architect, adept only at building barracks. These sort of conflicts of like beauty and discomfort, the skill of the architect, but only at this sort of Spartan utilitarian type of building. These are conflicting elements here. And that sort of drives the whole story forward. That issue of, I'm trying to protect my father's legacy, even though I'm talking about him in a way that might be seen as disrespectful. And we live in a society of tensions, a society of conflicts. Again, in contrast to something like socialist realism, which idealizes peasants and workers, which imagines them to be these sort of strong, upright, morally correct Boy Scouts of human beings. What Thiep argues here implicitly in this story is our society is complicated and it's riven with conflict. Even within ourselves, we experience the world through conflicting forces. And we get this later on, particularly, I think, with the gap between the father's perspective on labor and economic activity versus the wife's. So we learned that they raised German Shepherds. And what the footnote here says is presumably as guard dogs for the newly wealthy during Vietnam's transition to a free market economy in the 1980s, during which the story is set. We also learn that they have servants. In part 2, the narrator says, my wife, my daughters, and I did not have to worry about housework. From the meals to laundry, everything was relegated to the help. Now, the idea of relegating household tasks to the help doesn't really make that much sense under a communist government, under a communist social system. In theory, everybody is responsible for contributing to society and thereby getting out of it what they need. The idea of the help really implies a social class system, which is anti-communist, because communism is supposed to be an egalitarian system. And so we've got those tensions. And we see that the father is opposed to this new way of looking at the world, this liberalized or mixed economic way of looking at the world, because in part 3, what we get is this section. When I came home from work one day, I found my father standing near where my wife kept the dogs and chickens. He didn't look happy. I said, what's going on? He said, Ko and Lei work too hard. That's the names of the servants, their father and daughter, I think. They can't finish all their tasks. Can I help them? I said, let me ask T. That's the narrator's wife. When I asked her, my wife said, Father is a general. He may be retired, but he's still a general. He's the commander. If he acts like a common soldier, there will be chaos. So again, this sort of conflict between, on the one hand, the general, the father believes in this sort of egalitarian system based on the Marxist principle, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And if Ko and Lei have too much work to do and he has too little, then he should help them. 3, the wife, on the other hand, takes more of a capitalist approach and a social class approach, but also, strikingly enough, a Confucian approach. So it's a capitalist approach in the sense that this is clearly built along social class lines. The servants should do the work of the servants. Your father, the general, should do the work of the general, which is not to be a servant. And yeah, that's a very capitalist way of looking at things. Social class hierarchies are baked into capitalism. But again, it's also kind of a Confucian thing in the sense that within the Confucian worldview, everyone has a particular role to play in society, and social order is established and maintained when people abide by their place in the social order. So again, I think this is one of the most interesting pieces, one of the most interesting short stories, because of those conflicting forces, all of which operate subtly, right? These aren't, we never get a line, for instance, that says, my father and wife were in conflict. We get these disagreements narrated, exposing each of the characters' worldviews, and they're built on profoundly different fundamental assumptions.